On Tuesday morning, October 16, 1962, shortly after 9 a.m., President Kennedy called and asked me to come to the White House. He said that we were facing great trouble. Then shortly afterwards, in his office, he told me that a U-2 had just finished a photographic mission and that the intelligence community had become convinced that Russia was placing missiles and atomic weapons in Cuba. After that meeting, in President Kennedy's office started the largest confrontation between the world's biggest nuclear superpowers, and the world became closer to nuclear destruction than ever before. One of President Kennedy's first actions were to make a group of highly trained and highly ranked personnel called XCOM. XCOM was a committee made up of high-ranking officials for the crisis happening in Cuba. They were tasked with thinking of diplomatic solutions for ending the Cuban Missile Crisis, but they had trouble coming up with peaceful solutions that they could all agree on. They came up with ideas ranging from a blockade around the island to a preemptive strike on them. On October 17, 1962, President Kennedy is shown more images of missiles being built in Cuba. One facility had a medium-range R-12 missile, and they were placed in two places, one in Cristobal and one in Sanguila La Grande. The Cristobal complex had 16 launchers and 24 missiles and carried a 1-ton nuclear warhead, which had enough range to reach Washington, D.C. An intermediate-range R-14 missile were placed in two places, Guanaje and one in Remedios. Both of these sites were to have 8 launchers and 12 missiles each and also carried a 1-ton nuclear warhead, which had enough range to reach everywhere in the United States with the exception of Seattle. A short time after President Kennedy sat down with Khrushchev and assured President Kennedy that there would be no ground-to-ground missiles or offensive weapons placed in Cuba, that was a huge lie. It's on this day, October 22, 1962, that President John F. Kennedy announces to the American people that he has ordered a blockade of Cuba in response to the discovery that Soviet missiles were being installed on the island. In his televised speech, he condemned Soviet leader Khrushchev for the clandestine, reckless, provocative threat to world peace and warned that the United States was fully prepared to retaliate should the missiles be launched. The USSR deploying with such a massive force in a tropic environment was far from an easy task, but in order to trick the US, they disguised themselves as civilians, and most of the movement occurred at night to avoid being spotted by US spy planes. For Soviet troops, the ride from the USSR was a trip from hell. It was 100 degrees outside, and below deck it was even hotter, and the refrigeration system on the ships were not suitable, and their food would spoil easily. Soldiers were also confined to being below deck for risk of them being spotted by the U.S. October 24, 1962, Khrushchev refuses to remove the missiles from Cuba. The USSR's logic behind putting the missiles in Cuba was that since the United States put numerous missiles in range and literally right next door to the USSR, like in Turkey and Italy, that the United States should have no problem with them doing the same in Cuba. President Kennedy's strategy was to make a deal with the USSR instead of invading, that he would withdraw the missiles from Turkey in 6 months, that in exchange the USSR to take their nuclear forces from Cuba. The facts of the compromise Kennedy made were long hidden. Its full facts weren't revealed until 1989, that Kennedy's former speechwriter, Theodore Sorensen, confessed that he in fact edited out some of the details of the missile negotiation from the published version that the Attorney General Robert Kennedy's diary had. What we now know after all these years is that it is clear that President Kennedy actually made 2 negotiations. One was with Moscow, and the other was with his team of high-ranking advisors. Kennedy also made sure only people he trusted, which wasn't many, knew about how the meetings actually went down. The real lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis is not that the measured use of threats is the key to diffusing crises. It is that the essential challenge of crisis resolution is crafting an acceptable compromise to silence the drumbeat of war. This challenge is particularly critical in cases such as Cuba in 1962 and Iran today, when the price of failure is a potentially catastrophic confrontation.
What you gonna do with that dessert? Do what